Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started this morning. I never know if I should go off of the clock on my watch or the clock in the back. The clock in the back is about a minute slow. I went based on that clock this morning. Well, this says 10:01, that says 10. So, it's still about a minute slow, which is fine. I'd rather it be too slow than too quick. That gives me an extra minute. Let me say right off the bat this morning, I'm not going to take a whole lot of questions or comments. I might take some if we have time. I just don't think I'm going to have much time because I have a lot of material prepared, even though it's only 12 verses. And also the topic today is a little controversial. If you're familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, you probably know where we're going. And so to avoid things going off the rails, I'm not going to take a whole lot of comments. Maybe at the end we'll take some, but for the purpose of time primarily, and also to keep on track, we're going to just kind of power through this. So we're beginning Matthew chapter 19. We'll look at the first 12 verses this morning. And in a couple of different ways, this chapter is a transition. And on the one hand, it's a transition in a smaller sense because we're transitioning from a big unit of teaching, discourse, to a big unit of narrative. And so we're moving from a big clump of teaching to a big clump of narrative. And it's important to point out that these clumps of narrative do also have teachings in them. We're going to look at one unit of teaching here today, what Jesus says about marriage and so on. But they aren't big clumps of teaching where it's a continuous unit for oftentimes a full chapter, if not perhaps more, like in the Sermon on the Mount where it's 3 chapters. And so it's not as if it's a big unit of teaching following the same thread or the same thought. There are multiple things that are brought up within some of these narratives. And so they do often have a connection in some way, but they aren't necessarily the same unit of teaching like we see in some of these bigger discourses. One of the things that Matthew seems to do in order to mark the end of a big unit of teaching, and I think we touched on this not last week because we didn't teach from Matthew, but a couple weeks ago in our last Matthew class, where Matthew seems to insert this phrase, speaking of Jesus being finished, to mark the end of one of these big units of narrative. And so, for example, we have this in chapter 19 and verse 1. Chapter 18 was a big unit of teaching. In chapter 19 and verse 1 says, "Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan." So he's finished one thing and now he's on to this other thing. And Matthew does this. They say that there's 5 major discourses is what they say in Matthew. And in each of those you can kind of tell that they didn't just arbitrarily come up with that. It's because there's this big transition that takes place. So for example, the first major discourse is the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. And at the end of chapter 7 and verse 28, it says, "When Jesus had ended these sayings." So you see that unit you see that marker of transition there. At the end of chapter 10, that's the second discourse, the sending out of the 12, the limited commission as it's sometimes called. In chapter 11 and verse 1, it says, "When Jesus finished commanding his 12 disciples." And so there you have again that marker of transition. Jesus has finished this, and now he's moving on to this other thing. It happens again at the end of chapter 13. That's the chapter, the parables of the kingdom. That's regarded as the third major discourse. Chapter 13 and verse 53 says, "When Jesus had finished these parables." And so this is something that Matthew does. We see it now for the 4th time, where you see this mark of transition. Jesus has finished this, now he's moving on to this other thing. And so that's why scholars and people talk about the 5 major discourses of Matthew, is because there's that marker of transition there. And so we're moving from a big unit of teaching, of discourse, to a big unit of narrative. But that's not the only transition that's taking place here. You may have noticed it as I read verse 1 a moment ago. You not only have this transition, but there's another very important transition that's happening. This is also the beginning of the transition from Jesus' ministry in Galilee to now going back to Judea. And so as Matthew has been portraying things, Jesus had been in or around the Galilean region all the way since chapter 4. You may recall in chapter 4, John the Baptizer is arrested, and Jesus withdraws from there. He withdraws from Judea. This is right after the temptation of Jesus. He's tempted in the Judean wilderness by the devil. John the Baptizer gets arrested. Jesus withdraws from there. He goes to Galilee. That's where he calls his first disciples, so on and so forth. And so due to the threat of being arrested, Jesus withdraws in that instance. But now he's leaving Galilee and he's returning to Judea. And so Matthew's gospel account almost has this as a bookending kind of thing. It began in Judea. It's going to end in Judea. It's going to end in Jerusalem when Jesus goes to Calvary. And so now he's leaving Galilee. He's returning to Judea. Seemingly that threat of being arrested, it's no longer something Jesus is trying to avoid. He's going to be arrested. Jesus knows this. It's something he's going to meet head on. And so verse 1 again says, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. So we see here that Jesus has left Galilee. This, keep in mind, is Jesus' home region. He's from the town of Nazareth, which is in Galilee. He leaves Galilee and he's entered the region of Judea. And so he's making his way, of course, to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's where, as he's already foretold his disciples back in chapter 16 and in other places, he's going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests. He's going to be handed over to be killed, but he's going to be raised on the third day. And so he's already told his disciples this. He knows it's going to happen. He's working his way towards it. We're making our way to Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, in Matthew, this is the first time that Judea and the Jordan are mentioned at all since chapter 4. Matthew's focus to this point has primarily been on what Jesus has been doing in Galilee. In other gospel accounts, Jesus seemingly goes back and forth between Galilee and Judea. That's not how Matthew is portraying things. And so there's a time when he's in his home region of Galilee. They rejected him in his hometown. He's been in these other places, Capernaum and so on. Now he's returning to Judea. And of course, his journey to Jerusalem has begun. This is the moment where we're going to begin to slow down in Matthew's gospel account. This is something that's pretty common in the other gospel accounts, where things go pretty fast. You have a 3-year period talked about in a relatively short amount of time. Then all of a sudden you have about a week, and it's long and it's drawn out. That means that the writer, in this case Matthew, is wanting us to notice something about what's happening. And it's going to be, of course, about what's commonly called the passion narrative of Jesus. That word passion from the Latin literally just means suffering. And so he leaves Galilee. He's heading to Judea. He enters the Judean region. And next, Jesus is approached with a question about divorce. And so let's read verses 3 through 9, and let's see what Jesus has to say about this. Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." So this is obviously a sensitive subject, and it's a controversial subject. This is something that has divided and split churches for decades. Even in our area, there's been churches that have split. Some have ended up closing their doors because of the damage done from this. And so you have kind of two extremes when it comes to this particular topic. On the one hand, you have some who simply ignore what Jesus says. They ignore what he says about marriage. They ignore what he says about divorce. It doesn't matter to them. They care more about the world's standard on things, how the world has really demoralized marriage and the sanctity of it. They don't care about what Jesus says. But then you have the other hand, where you have some who've become perhaps a little overzealous about this, where maybe they overstep sometimes, maybe they tackle things in a not so tactful manner, where oftentimes you end up actually driving people away from the church entirely because of this. And so my hope this morning is to do so in a balanced way and to simply talk about what Jesus talks about here, to just let the text speak for itself. So the Pharisees asked this question: is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? That's the key there in their question. Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? The question is not about divorce itself. It's not, is divorce okay? The question is, what motive for divorce is okay? And this is something, if you study some of the historical context of this time, in particular first century rabbinic Judaism, this was a highly contested discussion in different rabbinic circles. You have one school of thought in this camp, you have another school of thought in that camp, and this was something that, and they kind of take after the Greeks in this sense, because the Greeks would often debate and they'd engage in dialogue and so on. The rabbis would sort of do this as well, and the matter of divorce was one in particular that got a lot of attention. And the basis of the discussion, more times than not, was Deuteronomy chapter 24. This is just verse 1, but the first 4 verses of this chapter speak, it's not about divorce, but it mentions divorce in it. And so just reading in verse 1, it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, she departs from the house. The basis of this is, okay, this woman gets a divorce, she goes and marries another person, he divorces her as well. She can't go back to her first husband. That's what this says in the first 4 verses of Deuteronomy. But here's the key of the discussion when it pertains to the topic at hand and how the Jewish rabbis were talking about it at this time. There's a key phrase in here. I don't know if you noticed it. He's found some indecency in her. That's what it says. The discussion is, well, what is the indecency? That's the discussion at hand. There's an indecency which leads to the certificate of divorce being handed to the woman. So the discussion is about the indecency. What is the indecency that leads to divorce? Well, you have, at this particular time, there's 2 primary rabbinic schools of thought about this. You have the Rabbi Shammai and you have the Rabbi Hillel. And these are the 2 dominant schools of thought at this particular time. And what was kind of happening in the time of Jesus is the point of view of Rabbi Shammai. That's kind of fun to say, isn't it? Rabbi Shammai. That was kind of the dominant school of thought for a long time, but it's beginning to decline in popularity, and you have this other point of view from Rabbi Hillel, and that's beginning to gain more prominence. And so what these schools of thought were is Shammai taught, and his disciples taught, that the indecency of Deuteronomy 24 is speaking of adultery and adultery only. That's the indecency that's mentioned. If you know what Jesus says here, Jesus leans, not that he is particularly in one camp or the other, but this is more in line with what Jesus is going to say later on. So on the one hand, Shammai teaches the indecency is adultery and adultery only. And adultery is the only grounds for divorce that you would have. But then you have the school of Hillel, and he and his disciples taught that the indecency could be any sort of offense that a man could take with a wife. And the common examples that you would hear them use at that time as well, if she looks at a man in a way that I don't like, if she burns my bread, if you burn toast, you're in trouble. You might get handed a certificate of divorce if your husband is under the Hillel school of rabbinic Judaism. And so you can see how these 2 are pinned against each other. One is a more conservative approach. The other is a more liberal approach. And by conservative and liberal, I don't mean like what we think today in terms of politics. Conservative is you have one instance of it. Liberal is where it could be any instance. You take it liberally in that sense. And so the school of thought of Shammai was declining in popularity the school of thought of Hillel was increasing in popularity. And you can understand why Hillel's point of view would be popular. If you have a prominent rabbi teaching this, whether it's right or wrong, you're going to have some people adhere to that, because that means they can pretty much divorce their wife for any reason whatsoever. Oh, you burnt my toast. There's the door. Bye-bye. And so you can see how that would be appealing. And this was a pretty prominent discussion in this period of time. And so the Pharisees come and they ask Jesus this question. Can it be for any reason? You can kind of see, reading into it, the Hillel Shammai perspective. Can it be any reason, or is it adultery only? One other detail to notice here about the Pharisees approaching Jesus. They're not just seeking information. It's not as if they're sincere seekers looking to try to attain some knowledge. It's not like they're genuinely curious as to what Jesus has to say. And the reason I say that is because in verse 3, it says they came up to him and tested him. Their motive is not to gain information. Their motive is not to learn what Jesus has to say. Their motive is to test Jesus and to catch him in a trap. This is what you commonly hear called a gotcha question. And what they're trying to do, seemingly, is pin Jesus against the law of Moses in some way. I'm not entirely sure what way that is. Perhaps they were more in line with the school of Hillel point of view. I think, historically speaking, most Pharisees fell in that camp. So is this an attempt I see here to try to pin Jesus against their interpretation of the Mosaic law. Notice I say it's their interpretation of it because it's not really what it says, and Jesus is going to clarify that. Another thing, we've seen them do this before. We see it here. They're following in the footsteps of the evil one. We saw this before where they tempted Jesus before. They tested Jesus before. That word test that's used in Matthew 19 and verse 3, it's the same word that's used in Matthew chapter 4 of what the devil is doing to Jesus. Except there it's translated as tempt. But it's actually the same word in the original language. There's a slight distinction, but it's the same word, and the context dictates the meaning. In this case, it's a testing. It's the same word that's used of the devil in chapter 4 as is being used of the Pharisees here. And so in other places, Jesus refers to them as sons of the evil one. And here they're living up to that name. They're following in the same footsteps as the evil one did when he tempted Jesus before. Now they're testing Jesus, and they're doing it. This is at least the second time that I can recall off the top of my head that they've done this. So they asked Jesus this question: is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And they're asking this not because they're genuinely curious, but because they're testing him. And so keep that in mind. That plays a part, perhaps, in what Jesus says in his response. Because his response is both stern, which it needs to be, but it's also a little provocative. Jesus has a way of being able to provoke people. Sometimes we think we can provoke people, but we don't know people's hearts. We don't know if that's going to lead to change, if that's going to drive them away. We don't know that. Jesus has a way of knowing this. He knows perhaps that there's nothing he could say that would change their hearts. So maybe he can be a little provocative. But we need to not think that we can do the same thing, because Jesus knows their hearts. We don't have that luxury. And so he says, I'll read it again. He says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So the very first words of Jesus in his answer are quite provocative, because he asked the question, have you not read? That's provocative to the Pharisees because, of course, they've read. They've read the entire Hebrew Bible. Of course, they've read Genesis, of all places, which is where Jesus quotes from. Of course, they've read Genesis. If you and I are familiar with Genesis 1 through 3, think of how familiar they would have been with it, because they really knew their Hebrew Scriptures. And so this would have been not just provocative, but perhaps even offensive to them. So this is, of course, provocative for them to hear. Of course we've read this, Jesus. Well, he's pointing this out to them, saying, well, you need to understand this, not just read it, but actually understand it. And so he begins by provoking them. And then his answer is stern. And it's stern in the sense, not harsh, but stern, in the sense that his answer is rooted entirely from Scripture. This is also the same tactic that Jesus used when dealing with the devil in chapter 4. So just as he dealt with that testing or that temptation, he's doing the same thing in this case as well with the Pharisees. His answer is rooted entirely in Scripture, and in particular from the creation account in the first couple chapters of Genesis. And so it's interesting, the Pharisees, they're going to rebut Jesus in verse 7, and they're going to go back to Moses. They want to take things back to Moses. But Jesus goes even farther back than Moses. He goes all the way back to creation. How things were when God first created things, that is the way things are supposed to be. That's God's intention. That's the way God made it. Unfortunately, through sin and through other things, it's become corrupted. You could look at a lot of examples of this in everyday life. You have something that God has created, and mankind has taken it and corrupted it, and so on and so forth. Marriage is an instance of that. Sex is an instance of that. Food is an instance of that, so on and so forth. You could go on down the list. So they want to take things back to Moses because they think they can take that particular interpretation. But Jesus goes back even further than Moses. He goes back to creation. So he references some things from Genesis here that are foundational for us. In particular, are foundational for our understanding of marriage. And so there's some principles here that we can draw out from what Jesus quotes from Genesis chapters 1 and chapter 2. On the one hand, you have the fact that he says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning? In the Greek language, that literally reads, the creating one. It's a participle in the Greek. He who created them. He calls God the creator here. God is the creator of all things, and he created mankind in addition to that. So we see here that God is the creating one. That's very important for us to remember. It's important to remember because God is the one who created it, and so God is the one who sets the standard for it. Doesn't matter what the world thinks about a particular subject. In this case, it's about marriage. The one who created it is the one who sets the standard. God is the creating one. And so he's the one who sets the standard. As the author, he's the one who has the authority. That's something you could remember. We see also that this is the way it was from the beginning. This goes all the way back, even before sin is in the picture. This is the way God intended things to be. We see, getting into some nitty-gritty details here, God made them male and female. Meaning, gender, sex, whatever you want to call it, they're the same thing, despite what the world tells you. It's a binary system. You're either one or the other. Now, I know there's rare cases where sometimes genetically you might be a little in between, but don't let the exception be the excuse for the norm. And so God made them male and female. That's the way God created them. Sometimes you hear someone say, well, I'm this. Well, that's not the way God made you. You got to remember how God made you. We also see that when a man leaves his parents, in other words, he graduates from his parents' household, he becomes his own household, he holds fast to his wife. That's what the ESV says. Other versions use the word joined or united. He's joined to his wife. He's united to his wife. He holds fast to his wife. In other words, you're together and you're not going to be separated. And to take this even further, Jesus says the two become one. In other words, they're intimately together. And I don't mean intimately in the way that you're thinking. I mean intimately in the sense that they are so together that there's no wedge or anything that could be between them. That's the way marriage is supposed to be, where the two become as if they are one. You're one united, married couple. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way God created it. That's the way God intends for it to be. But as is often the case, we often fall short of that. We see also that it is God who has joined them together. Oftentimes, when I do weddings, and I've done a few, I'll talk about it and say, oh yeah, I married them. I did their wedding. I whatever. I was just having a conversation with someone the other day because it was their anniversary. I say recently, it was a few months ago. I said, oh yeah, that was one of my favorite weddings that I've done because it was really, it was people I really love, people I went to school with. It was a great time. But the preacher isn't the one who joins them together. Nor is it the state of Michigan or wherever you're from that joins you together. Although legally you need some certain things for that to be legal in the eyes of the state. It's God who joins a man and a wife together. What this shows us is that marriage is an institution created by God. And so in our marriages, and I'm not going to include myself in it because I'm not married, but in your marriages you need to glorify God because He's the one who created it. So that's important to remember as well. And as Jesus says, it is not man's place to separate what God has joined together. As we'll see later on, not only is it not man's place, but it's really not even possible for man to do in the eyes of God. And then one last thing, I think this is the last thing on that. This kind of indirectly, it's not mentioned necessarily by name, but it indirectly prohibits homosexual marriages and also polygamous marriages. Notice it's one man, one woman. It's not one man married to 6 women, despite what the reality TV shows portray. Those shows drive me crazy. That's so gross. Nor is it a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, or a non-binary person and a non-binary person. It's none of that either. It's one man, one woman, 2 becoming one, together forever, joined together by God, not separated by man. And so this indirectly prohibits homosexual and polygamous marriages as well. Have you realized that, maybe not polygamy necessarily, because I don't think that's legal, but non-monogamous relationships are becoming very, very common in our society? I didn't realize this, but I had a friend telling me he uses one of those dating apps. He lives down in Texas. He lives in a big town, and so there's a bunch of people on the dating apps down there. And he'll go through profiles, and it will say ENM. And he's like, what does that mean? Ethically non-monogamous. I don't know what the heck that means. I don't know how you could be ethically that. But some people are like that, and it's growing in popularity, and it blows my mind. To me, that's just gross. From what I've heard about marriage, one wife would be enough. I don't know how you could deal with more than one. Comments like that are probably why I'm not married. So getting back to Jesus' response, it's stern and it's provocative. We've seen him provoke him. Now he's being stern with them. His answer is rooted entirely in Scripture. And so using the creation story, using the creation account from Genesis chapters 1 and 2, he shows us what God's desire for marriage and divorce is. And what he says in short is God joins a man and a woman together, and they're not supposed to be separated. That is how God intends it to be. That is the ideal situation. If you're married, ideally, you stay married. Now, I understand sometimes it doesn't work out that way because we're sinful, but that's the way God intends for it to be. And so what's interesting here, when you look at the dynamic of their question, the Pharisees had asked if it was lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause. You can kind of see they're in one camp, and Jesus is in an entirely different camp. Because they're asking about any cause, yet Jesus is saying you shouldn't be divorcing your wife at all, yet alone for any cause. So you can see kind of the contrast that's being brought up here between Jesus and really between God's way for marriage and the way that it had been corrupted even back then, yet alone how far it's become corrupted today. So Jesus gives that answer, and the Pharisees respond to Jesus' answer. And again, I mentioned it earlier, they take things back to Moses. So in verse 7, they said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" Notice how they phrase that question. Either they're being deceptive, or they have a total lack of understanding about the law of Moses. For being so pious and so self-righteous, that doesn't bode well either way for them. And so they say that Moses commanded one to give a certificate of divorce and to send a woman away. So this raises the question. They say that Moses commanded divorce. Is divorce a commandment? And is Jesus contradicting Moses? This is what they want. They're trying to inch their way to this on the part of Jesus. And Jesus beautifully, as he so often does, he has a way of tying the loose ends up and ending up really kind of embarrassing them because of a silly question. And you'll notice after this, they don't respond again. Jesus shows them that they are misinterpreting Moses. Verse 8, he said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. He brings it again back to the beginning, you see there. So what we see here is that Deuteronomy 24, this is one, if not the thing that they're alluding to when they reference Moses commanding the certificate of divorce. Deuteronomy 24 does not command divorce. That's kind of a ridiculous thing to say. You can kind of see the absurdity of it. It doesn't command divorce, but it does permit it. And Jesus explains why it was permitted. It's not because God is saying divorce is okay. It's because of their hardness of hearts. This is what you might call a concession, because of the state of sin. Divorce was not, nor is it today, based on what Jesus says, part of God's plan. But he allowed it, just like he allows other things to happen. It's not part of God's will for our life to be divorced. But sometimes it happens. And I want to make this point clear. God allowing divorce does not mean that God approves of it. God allows things to happen all the time that he does not approve of. God allows us to sin. He gives us the free will to do that, but he doesn't approve of our sin. No matter what that sin might be, divorce would be included in that. And we know that God does not approve of divorce, despite what the Pharisees were trying to portray, because the Bible is pretty clear about divorce. You could think about Malachi 2 and verse 16. In the ESV, it reads this way, the one who hates and divorces his wife covers himself with violence. I don't know about you, but I don't think being covered in violence is a good thing. Alternate translations, some that you probably have memorized, such as the New King James or the New American Standard, I think translate it this way, where it says, for I hate divorce, says the Lord. I'm not sure about the disparity in the translation. I'm not sure why they're different. I'd have to study that. I'm not a Hebrew expert, so I can't look at the Hebrew and dictate the right way to translate it. But bottom line, divorce is something that God does not approve of. Malachi 2:16 makes that clear no matter what way you translate it. You can see it in other examples as well. Like, for example, under the Levitical priesthood, under the law of Moses, priests were forbidden from marrying women who had been divorced. You could look at places like Leviticus 21 and Ezekiel 44 as examples of this. And so, what does that mean to say, and God saying, hey, Mr. Priest, you can't marry this particular kind of person? It suggests that divorce is at odds with holiness. Because keep in mind what priests were meant to be. They're meant to be holy. They're meant to be consecrated. Even more consecrated than the people of Israel were supposed to be. Because that's the ideal for all of Israel, is to be a holy nation. But the priests within that holy nation are consecrated even more. That's why you have all of these requirements for the priests and the things they needed to do in order to make intercession for God's people. This suggests that divorce is at odds with holiness. There's an interesting parallel, something that I had not thought of, but one of the commentators I read pointed this out, and it makes sense. The idea of God allowing something, but not approving of it, it's something you see in other cases, and a great example of this that I think really is a good parallel is the idea of Israel having a king. So you may recall from 1 Samuel chapter 8 how they were under the system of judges at that time. The judges were kind of the leaders of the people at that time. They didn't have a king. Samuel is still in the picture. They come to Samuel, they say, your sons aren't going to cut it. We want a king. Samuel felt like, obviously, they were rejecting him. They were rejecting his sons. But the Lord said, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. The Lord is supposed to be their king. It's supposed to be a theocracy in that sense. But they rejected the Lord and said, no, we want a king to be, we want a person to be our king. We want to be like the other nations. We want to have a king. And it's interesting, God obviously disapproved of Israel having a king because he is supposed to be their king. And yet he allowed it to happen. And not only did he allow it to happen, but he even had provisions in the law of Moses for it. You can read this in Deuteronomy chapter 17. There are laws in place for if and when Israel was going to set up a king. And you contrast that with 1 Samuel 8, and it's an interesting dynamic here. God obviously doesn't approve of it, but he allows it to happen. And so Jesus' point that we see is this. God has always disapproved of divorce. Divorce is not part of God's plan. When God joins two together, they're meant to stay together. The two become one, and they're not supposed to split apart. And as Jesus says, this is how God has created it from the beginning. You hear Jim sometimes talk about the principle of firsts. When something is in its origin, that's usually how it's supposed to be. That's the standard that's set. It's the principle we take a lot of times in things pertaining to the church, how we do things, so on and so forth. That's how they did it in the first century. That's how the early church did it. So that's how we do some things. Well, you look at from the beginning, this is how it's supposed to be. So that's the model that we have for ourselves. God conceding it under the law does not mean that it's okay. There's a really, I think, criminally underrated quote from the TV show The Office. This is an episode where one of the workers, Phyllis, is getting married to Bob Vance of Vance Refrigeration. And Michael is just butting in, and he's being Michael Scott. And one of the things he does is at the reception, he goes up to give a speech. Well, he's not supposed to give a speech, but he's giving one anyway. And one of the things he says, this is something I say a lot if I'm doing a wedding in the rehearsal, because I think it's hilarious. Maybe I think this is funny, and it's not funny. But Michael Scott says, Webster's dictionary defines wedding as the fusing of two metals with a hot torch. The joke is he's read the definition for welding, not wedding. He's kind of a dunce, and so that's the joke. But it's an interesting image to think about when you think about welding, where you have two things and they're literally fused together. That's kind of how marriage is, in a sense. He goes on to say, you two are metals, you're gold metals. And the whole thing derails after that. But I think the image of welding is kind of an appropriate way to think about marriage. And so, Jesus, he says this about marriage. And to further make his point, he makes a bold statement in verse 9 with an exception. And really, it's more of a concession than an exception. And what he says here is if one divorces their wife and marries another, they are committing adultery. The exception is in the case of sexual immorality. The word that's used there is porneia. That might sound familiar. It's where we get our word pornography from. The word is a kind of umbrella term that refers broadly really to immorality of various kinds, but more specifically sexual immoralities of various kinds. And so included in that, you would have adultery. Adultery is included in that. So also is fornication, which we usually think of as sex before marriage, premarital relations. Homosexuality would be included in that. Bestiality would be included in that. Incest would be included in that, so on and so forth. And so it's kind of an umbrella term, and it can refer to a lot of different things. Well, this is kind of an interesting thing that Jesus brings up here, where if you divorce and then you remarry, you commit adultery. Well, why is that the case? One commentator put it really nice, and so I'm going to quote him. This is from, I forget his first name. That's JP or something. JT or JP, something France. He says it substitutes a new sexual union for the indissoluble union which God has created. What God has joined together, let not man separate. Well, when man does separate it, that doesn't mean that it's really separated. And so in God's eyes, what he has joined together, not only should it not be separated, but really it cannot be separated except in the cases of death. That's why in your wedding vows you'll often say, "Till death do us part." But then that raises an interesting question. Why make this concession for sexual immorality? Well, in this particular case, the guilty party, the one who commits the sexual immorality, they've already broken the marriage. They've broken their vow. Davies and Allison, they are the main commentary that I usually use for Matthew. It's a great commentary exegetically. They have a lot of scholarly junk in there. But exegetically, it's pretty good. They put it this way. They say divorce is not adultery, and by that they mean divorce and remarriage, only when the marriage bond has already been broken by unfaithfulness. That's profound to think about. So, Jesus' words here are, I think, pretty plain. God obviously disapproves of divorce to the point where if you divorce and remarry without that concession, then you're committing adultery. So why is this such a controversial topic, in particular in American churches of Christ today? Why is this so controversial? Well, firstly, for many, it's a personal issue. They say, I've never actually seen the studies on this, but they say 1 out of 2 marriages in the United States end in divorce. Now, that's a little skewed, because that includes people on their 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th marriages. If those marriages end in divorce, they're clumped in with that as well. So it's a little skewed. It's probably lower than that in reality, but that's still a staggering number. And from what I've read, Christians, that number is not that far off even from Christians. So for a lot of people, it's a personal issue. And another thing is the controversy, it's not necessarily on if divorcing is okay and if it's okay to remarry. That's not necessarily the issue, but the issue is if that can be forgiven. That's where the rubber meets the road. Can this be forgiven? What does this look like? So this is something that has split churches, continues to split churches, continues to split fellowships. You might hear of a congregation withdrawing fellowship from someone over something like this. And so this controversy is something that, frankly, I don't like, because who likes controversy, right? I guess some people might. In my personal opinion, this is not an issue that's worth quarreling. And here's why. Not that divorce and remarriage isn't a substantial issue. It's very substantial. But when it comes to the issue of can it be forgiven and so on and so forth, at best this is an ambiguous and an extremely nuanced topic. And it's something that you need to look at oftentimes in a particular case. And oftentimes in those situations you don't have all the details. You're oftentimes relying on gossip. You're relying on secondhand chatter. It's not a good way to govern things if you're the body of Christ. And so at best this is an ambiguous and it's an extremely nuanced topic. At worst, it is highly contentious and divisive. And I tend to avoid the highly contentious and divisive topics, not because I'm trying to avoid the truth, but there's some people who won't listen no matter what you say. They're so far in this camp or they're so far in this camp. And oftentimes you drive people away. When you're trying to win souls for the Lord, that's not what you want to do. I think of the words of Jesus in the parable of the weeds, when he talks about there's all these weeds sown in with the wheat. And they say, should we go out and get the weeds? Jesus says no, or the master says no in the parable, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. I don't want to pluck up any wheat. I don't want to drive people away. So when it comes to this particular matter, I'll let the Lord decide that. I'm out of time. We'll pick up in verse 10 next week. Thanks.